You're listening to a BGE podcast.
Friends and family gather round and fire up the barbecue. Let the smoke waft and float, that's what we're gonna do. You can't deny there's nothing like friends and family and food. Don't sit still, pull out your grill, we're gonna have a barbecue.
It is time for the main event, the battle you've all been waiting for. Let's get ready to rumble!
Don't worry what you gotta do, 'cause if you're looking, you ain't cooking. Fire up the barbecue. Fire up the barbecue.
In the red corner, weighing in at 15 3/4 pounds, all decked out in a sealed cryovac package and hailing from the very front chest of the cow, we have the king of cuts, the beast of beef, the whole packer brisket. And in the blue corner, weighing in at a mere 2.5 pounds, decked out in saran wrap and butcher paper, and hailing from the front shoulder between the neck and ribs, we have the poor man's brisket, the Chuck Roast. Hey folks, welcome back to another edition of the Blind Grilling Experience. My name is Chris Peltz. I am the most interesting griller in the world, and that's right. Today we are talking about brisket versus chuck roast and why these two meats are so often compared and put head to head in a battle. Because I'm going to tell you something. If you like one, you're going to love the other. I mean, that's just the way that it goes. There's so many things that are similar in these cuts of meat, and there's a reason why they call the chuck roast the poor man's brisket. But to really understand, first of all, the difference and the similarities between these two cuts of meat, let's talk about where they come from. The chuck roast comes from the front shoulder. Sometimes that front shoulder is called the clod. You've heard us talk about clod tenders on this podcast, which is a kind of a cut of steak that will compare oftentimes to filet mignon. Sometimes in restaurants, the clod tender is called the petite steak. I'm not sure if it's sometimes called a chuck eye or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if they're not the same cut. But I know you can get chuck steaks. But what's interesting about the clod tender and the shoulder cut, just as on a pig, when you talk about a Boston butt or the pork shoulder, in competitions they have something they call the money muscle, right? So you get this pulled pork where it comes out in really long strips, and then there's this piece of meat that they call the money muscle, which is really where the juice and the tenderness and what all the competition guys are looking for and what they're aiming for, turning in for those competitions because of how tender it is. And the front shoulder of beef has that money muscle as well, that clod tender. And right in that area is where you're cutting the chuck roast from, is that front shoulder, that clod portion of the beef. And again, it's between the neck and sometimes part of the neck and going back towards the rib cage. And sometimes when it's cut and those chuck steaks are cut as well, you're right on the front of the ribeyes, right? I mean, so you're getting a piece of meat that is very close to a ribeye steak, which is awesome. And those chuck steaks are full of flavor. no doubt about it. Sometimes, chuck roast will be used. Sometimes they're called arm roast or various things, but that chuck roast will be used and is great for stew meat and things like that. But it really shines in low and slow cooking. And that's really what we're talking about. And one of the reasons why it's called the poor man's brisket is because you can pick up a chuck roast for between $16 and $20. 16, let's say to $16 to $25, between 2 and 3 pounds. Now, here's kind of the interesting thing about that is they're only going to run about 2 to 3 pounds, give or take half a pound on either side. Extremely large chuck roast, maybe 3.5 pounds, but generally what I've found, at least in our area, is 2 to 3 pounds. But they're anywhere from $7.99, $8.99 a pound, right? And so even if you get them at $8 a pound, let's say you get a 3-pound chuck roast, $8 a pound, that's $24, right? Taxes and all of Uncle Sam's dues. I mean, so you're looking at $25 regardless, right, for a 3-pound chuck roast. And, that is a whole lot better sounding. You say, $25 as opposed to $60 for a brisket. Now, granted, brisket per pound is cheaper, right? So you can get brisket sometimes, while I haven't seen them this low in a while, but sometimes $2.99 a pound. Right now, they're probably running between $3.99 to $4.99 a pound. And for choice and, prime and Wagyu and all that just goes up, and up, so you can pay $5.99 to $8.99 a pound or more. But even if you're getting at $4 a pound, you get a 15-pound brisket, that's $60, right? And so $25, $24 as opposed to $60, people call that chuck roast then the poor man's brisket because of the results you get. Even though it costs more per pound, you're getting a smaller cut of meat with practically the same results, right? And granted, you don't have all the leftovers, but when you're intimidated by cooking this large cut of meat, then, if you're afraid you're going to ruin it, losing out on $20, anywhere from $16 to $24, is a little bit easier pill to swallow than ruining a $60 chunk of meat. And so that's kind of where people are coming from when it comes to this idea of the poor man's brisket. You're going to cook them the same way if you're throwing them on the smoker. Now, I'm going to give you a recipe for something both in a crock pot and on the smoker that is a little bit different, non-traditional. I think we've talked about it on this podcast before, but something I really want to kind of illustrate to you guys so that you understand, just how versatile this chuck roast really can be. Because it's packed full of flavor, and is absolutely an amazing chunk of meat, no doubt about it. Whereas the brisket, right, is this huge chunk of meat coming from the front of the cow, right? We're still talking about the chest area in front of where you would get the chuck roast. And it's made up of really 2 muscles, which we refer to as the point and the flat, with a little decal piece in between holding them together. And, it used to be a very undesirable part of the cow before people learned how to cook it really low and slow, which most folks attribute all that down in Texas, where that was first done and people started learning how to do cook briskets right. But regardless of which one you're going to cook, most folks, and I get this question all the time, what about a chuck roast? What about doing a chuck roast? Because they refer to it as the poor man's brisket. They refer to it and talk about these results that you can get. And yeah, if you're intimidated by the brisket, if you can do a chuck roast and are pleased with the results you get from a chuck roast, then there's no reason why you shouldn't jump into a brisket. There's a few reasons why I think you should go from the chuck roast to the brisket and not just stay with the chuck roast. And part of that is all the meat that you are getting and some of those differences between the flat and the point, and all the leftovers you get, because you're getting a huge chunk of meat, but per pound it's so much cheaper. And there's so much you can do with leftovers of both of these cuts of meat that I think you would enjoy and really love. But there can be a subtle texture difference between the two. But again, if you like one, you will love the other, right? And really kind of regardless of which one you're talking about, you can put the like and love in either side of the column of brisket or chuck roast, and it pretty much is going to work either way. If you love one, you're going to love the other for sure. And so in essence, you're going to cook these low and slow. Now, some folks refer to my method as bordering on the hot and fast. I don't go up to 300 like the drum smoker guys will do in the competitions, but I am cooking at 275 on the Big Green Egg, and I'm going to cook them direct. So let's start with the chuck roast. And a couple of things about the chuck roast that I really like. First of all, it is easier to work with. It generally comes trimmed, and so there's really nothing you have to do or need to do with the chuck roast for the most part. At least where I'm at, they're trimmed. I don't need to do any trimming on the chuck roast. So I can get it. I can put my duck fat spray all over it and get my favorite rub out and rub it down. Whether I'm going just a all-purpose rub, salt, pepper, garlic, whether I'm doing, something like the Cattleman's Smoky Chipotle and some Cosmos, whether it's like a cow cover or, cash cow or whatever rubs you want, a combination of rubs that you want. All of those things are great. But you get your grill set up, indirect smoke for 275 degrees. And once it's ready, you put it on the grates and you let it go for about 3.5 to 4 hours. And that's both the chuck, and the brisket. But, talking about the chuck roast, we're going to let it go for, 3.5 to 4 hours. And then we're going to wrap it in foil. We're going to stick a probe in it, and we're going to bring that internal temp up to around 200 to 203 degrees. And then we're going to search for probe tender, just like we would on a brisket. And it's awesome. It's absolutely amazing, right? That fat is broken down. It renders down. It's a juicy, tender, just heavenly bite. It really and truly is. Now, there's some things that you can do to change that up, right? So if you want to practice your brisket cook, all right, but you don't want to spend that money just in case you don't get it right, go with the chuck roast and follow those very simple directions. You'll love it. But if let's say you've done that, maybe you've moved on to brisket, but you still like the chuck roast and you want to change it up, you want to do something a little bit different. We actually have a YouTube video that we did with the chuck roast. And I got the idea from Meat Cranium Barbecue's YouTube channel years and years ago. But it's one that we have made. In fact, we've made it a couple times in the past couple of weeks because we love it so much. It's one of our absolute favorites. And you can do it on the grill, or you can do it in the house in a crock pot, and it works awesome. First of all, on the grill, 275, you're going to put it on the grill after you get it seasoned up the way you want it. And this time I would really just go salt, pepper, garlic. And I would put it on the grill for 2 hours to catch some smoke. Once you get it catching some smoke after about 2 hours, you take it off and you put it in an aluminum pan. And in that aluminum pan, on top of the chuck roast, you're going to put a stick of butter. You're going to open a package of au jus seasoning and a package of dry ranch seasoning and dump it all over that chuck roast. And then you're going to seal it either with a lid or with foil across the top, seal it up, put it back on the smoker, and put a probe in that meat and let it go until, again, it's probe tender, internal temp around 200 degrees, and then start probing it for tenderness. It is awesome. That au jus and that ranch seasoning and that butter, and it is so good. But let's say you're one of our listeners who don't have a smoker, or, it's been 97 degrees here. Some places and folks I've talked to, it's been 110 degrees. And you're like, I don't want to go outside. I don't want to mess with a smoker. And you've got a crock pot sitting at home. Take that chuck roast, stick it in the crock pot, put a stick of butter in that crock pot with it, dump that au jus and that ranch packet seasoning on that chuck roast. This time you're going to take one of those packets and fill it with water and dump that in there as well. Put the lid on it, turn it on. You do this by 8 o'clock in the morning. It'll be done after by 4 o'clock. If you get home 5, 6 o'clock, whatever, it'll be done. And that juice is perfect for not only drizzling over the meat, you could make a gravy with it. You could put it over some mashed taters. Just whatever you want to do with it. It makes awesome sandwiches. Leftovers, it's good cold, it's good hot. Sometimes I'll make some sandwiches with it, as leftovers, wet, cold or hot. Sometimes I'll put it in the air fryer and put some horseradish cheese on top and melt that cheese on top of that chuck roast in the air fryer. Oh, man. Just so many things. So good. Awesome cut of meat. And so that is something that I think you guys would love and really like to do. And again, you get good at chuck roast. There's no reason why you can't do a whole brisket. Absolutely no reason why you can't do a whole brisket at all. And that's, again, as we go to and we talk about that whole brisket, that's where you're going to have your leaner portion and your fatty portion, from the lean flat to the fatty point, which is where you're going to get your burn ends. And probably the biggest difference on these two cuts of meat, from what I can tell, is the trimming that you're going to have to do. And the thing about brisket, if you watch these guys on these videos, they're going to talk about trimming a brisket. And they're going to get these restaurant owners, they're going to get these competition guys, and they're going to talk about how much trimming they do on their briskets, all the things that they're cutting off. And they're going to talk about getting it aerodynamic and all of these things. And I get it, especially if you're in competition, if you're in a place where the way it looks is as just about as vital as how it tastes, then sure, I can understand. I can get it. But listen, you can throw a whole packer on without trimming it. It can be done. You're fine to do that. You're going to have a lot of grease, a lot of drippings, and just, be prepared and ready for that. That, a brisket has, this whole fat cap that comes untrimmed. And so if you can do some trimming, you don't stress out about the trimming. If you're intimidated by it, you really don't have to worry about it, because you're not doing competitions, right? You're not, you're just going to feed your family and a bunch of friends, and they're going to eat good, especially if they like, that fat from that meat, like I do. I mean, I love it. And so I think they would be happy with that. But if you can, and you're comfortable trimming and getting it kind of an equal amount of fat across top, you're not wanting to cut it all off, right? You're just wanting to make it really even. And if you have these really hard spots on the brisket that as you touch, they're like almost like solid, they're not going to render down as much or as well, and you can cut those off. I mean, the way I feel them, right? A lot of folks obviously can look and can see, and they can cut and trim and do all that. But if you're blind or visually impaired, generally you can tell the difference between the fat cap and the meat side. And and even where the point and the flat meet. Sometimes if you can have someone with you who's sighted that can confirm what you're feeling, and you get used to that, you'll have a better understanding, and you'll know when you're grabbing it what it is you're touching and what you're feeling. That can be helpful. But ultimately, if you're blind or visually impaired, first of all, you be able to figure this out. What is that fat? What is that hard fat that's not going to render? And you can cut it out, cut it off. And, but if if you question it, don't worry about it. Just leave it on. You'll be fine. Right. Just understand, if you could have something to catch the drippings, you'll be better off, the less trimming you do, because the more fat you're going to have going down, all over your grill. But brisket, in that respect, a lot, people get intimidated when they watch these videos and they start talking about all the trimming, everything they're doing. You can get used to that. You can get to that point. That's possible. You're capable of doing that, but it's not necessary to cook it. You need to understand that. Can you get better results if you do some trimming? Yes, you probably can. But again, it's not something that's absolutely necessary. You're still going to have an awesome cut of meat. It's still going to have some awesome flavor, great taste. It's going to be good. It's just going to be good. But again, brisket, you're going to put it on 275 indirect, as I do on the Big Green Egg, but I would do 275 even on a pellet grill. And I'd let it go for 4 hours, and I would wrap it and put a probe in it and let it go until it hits around that 203 mark, and then look for probe tender. So that's what we're going for on those briskets. And again, it's just the flavor you get from that fat, again, they've got the flat part that is leaner than the point, which where you get your burn ends, which is really the fattier part of the brisket. But you'll figure out how to slice it, dice it up, cube it up, however you want to serve it. And, that's definitely one of my favorite cooks, one of my go-tos when it comes to, feeding large crowds, but also taking the leftovers. Brisket not only makes for great chili, it makes for, quesadillas, tacos, right? There's so many things you can do with brisket. And, we've talked about making some pimento cheese and brisket wontons. Oh man, they're so good. So good. Brisket on a salad. It's just endless what you can do with the leftover brisket if you're worried about such a large cut of meat. But just as folks who do, they cook something at the beginning of the week so they can have leftovers throughout the week, brisket is a great cut for that. It really and truly is. And so is a chuck roast. The problem with that is the chuck roast, you're going to have, just such a smaller cut of meat. You may not have as many, or as much leftovers with that chuck roast. But, again, upfront cost, the chuck roast is really the way to go if you're intimidated by these large cuts of meat at first. But I promise you, if you can nail that chuck roast, which you can do, if you can do that, the brisket's a breeze, man. So many people are intimidated by brisket, and it's really one of the easier cuts to do. I think it's just the idea that, that's what everyone talks about, right? That's what everyone seems to want to do, and they talk it up. It's the biggest deal when it comes to these competitions. And so people become intimidated and think it must be the hardest thing to do. And it's really not. It really isn't. Yeah, you can mess them up, right? A lot of folks have, and it can be done. I talk to guys that are trying to put briskets on pellet grills at 180 degrees for 12 hours, and they get this dry shoe leather piece of meat. It happens, right? And again, you can watch these videos but I'm trying to help you more than anything else. I want you to be successful. And I put these videos out, I put this podcast out because I'm trying to help those who are blind or visually impaired, especially, to be successful in cooking, gain that independence and confidence to not only be productive in your own home, but just in your neighborhood with your friends, coworkers. You know, they want you to cook because you're doing something that they're afraid to do. And because when we talk about being intimidated by the brisket, I'm not talking about blind or visually impaired folks. I'm talking about sighted folks that I talk to weekly that are intimidated and haven't broken down and cooked a brisket yet because they're scared to, because they just don't want to take that risk. And I'm just shaking my head. I'm like, you know what? You guys, you can do it. You can do it. But the great thing about this podcast, if I can convince you to give it a try, I know you'll be successful. You will. They're not going to be impressed because a blind guy did it. They're going to be impressed because they're afraid to do it and don't think that they can. Right. And if anyone was to bring it in, they'd be like, wow, you nailed it. This is good. Blind or sighted, it doesn't matter. You know, they will be impressed with what you're able to do, both with a chuck roast and with a brisket. And you get that point separated after it's cooked, and you get it cut into cubes, and you get those burnt ends, you know, and for people to grab and eat. And there's a reason why they call it meat candy, because oh man, that you just can't stop eating it.
Friends and family gather around.
All right, folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Blind Grilling Experience. I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope you understand a little bit better of why they call the chuck roast the poor man's brisket. Give it a try. You will love it. Absolutely love it. Whether it's on the smoker, whether it's in the crock pot, it doesn't matter. And if you nail the chuck roast, bite the bullet, grab a huge packer brisket, throw it on the smoker, and enjoy. Remember, folks, if you're looking, you ain't cooking.
If you're looking, you ain't cooking. Fire up the barbecue. Fire up the barbecue.